lives of others. My story was I was extremely didactic and I was changing to a dialogic practice, and I documented that a lot, and the way I was doing it was through a process of encouraging children to sit in a circle and discuss and think using picture books. And I was patting myself on the back that for 1 hour every week we were thinking critically, we were doing great gashka all together, and I thought, I'm the bee's knees now. And then one day I had to do the RSE lesson in 3rd class, you know, where you send out the questions in advance, the lesson to the parents, and you stick to the format, to the questions and the piece of text. I used to do my thinking circles in a separate room, so I took the children in there to teach this RSE lesson, sat down, and it was the care of the baby in the womb. And we were going to be introducing specific language. The V word was going to be introduced. And so I was very nervous because I had a mixed class and I didn't know where it was going. Anyway, I introduced the topic and they immediately started talking about mothers and aunts whose water's broke and I said, hold on, I have to read this piece and then I'm going to ask you these questions. And their faces were like thunder. And this is our space. And it was the most profound learning from my PhD for me, that I thought I could corral thinking into 1 hour a week. And that was the time I was giving them, do you know, and I thought I was being dialogic. I was giving them that freedom for 1 hour and then pulling it back. And I went back into the room and I said, what's going on? Why? And said, that's our space for talking and you didn't let us talk. And I said, I couldn't. Sure, this is the lesson. I have to stick to this. And said, well, then you shouldn't have brought us in there. You should have done it in here if it was a normal class. And I realised, yes, you're dead right. And that was, to me, that was the moment that I changed my practice, I think. That learning that I still was in control and I was yet preaching that I was, you know, allowing children to talk. So I was coming up against this idea of being a living contradiction. I was holding these values about dialogue and dialogic practice, but I was denying them in reality. 4 years into my PhD, I thought I was still doing something that I wasn't doing. So it was back to Whitehead's idea of being a living contradiction and trying to undo that contradictory practice. Also, I met some of those students recently. They're now all 23, 24, finished college, and what I learned from my own work was that the cognitive was not what was important to them. I met a group of about 12, and it was the affective, how doing this thinking in a circle affected their interpersonal relationships, their relationship with me, how the children who were leaving for learning support and coming back in, how they recognised that they could think just as well as everybody else, and how they got courage from it. And it was all affective domain learning outcomes that I hadn't intended at all, which was really interesting, that they still remembered it as well. It was another interesting thing. So making a difference could be seen as the significance of my research, the significance at a personal, a professional, an institutional, or the wider educational domain. And has that any relevance for ye now, having heard those narratives, victory narratives if you like? So we'll do another bit of discussion, just anything at all that struck you about how it's about this affective domain stuff that is very, very significant. And is that, anyway, over to ye. How are we doing in time, Maureen?
Well, we have to say, if we're going to finish at 1 for our break of 12 minutes.
Okay, so we talk for about, discuss for about 3 minutes and then feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
I need about 2 hours for one.
Try. Talk fast. A bit of learning all the time. Teaching. Bernie, sorry, can I call on you to summarise what you think you heard there? Yeah. Yeah. Can you sorry. Yeah, okay, we just take, I'm asking Bernie to summarise what you heard, which isn't fair because I didn't tell you were going to be doing that, but yeah.
No, No, we had a very interesting discussion about a personal significance that Anne was describing to us, you know, which was a very moving one, and which she didn't see as significance at first. She actually was looking at it as a failure, you know, on her own behalf, but it took somebody else to point out to her that actually it wasn't a failure and that it was quite a significant event, you know, in her own. Very positive,
And that's so true, that we tend to not share those failure moments, and that self-study is full of that we do share those moments that make us stop and think. Do you want to add anything?
It was only through that sharing of the failure that I got Brookfield's other lens of the peer that actually turned the whole thing completely
into learning
for me.
And that's the whole thing, is what have I learned from the reflection on that. And reflection, as Maureen and I were doing a talk there recently, it's not something you do on your own usually. It's you know, you can learn and reflect really well with others when you involve others in kind of running ideas past them.
If you do it at home, it's just evil.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on how much other literature you're bringing to it.
That's
true. And from this group here, Katrina, I'll ask you to summarise there what you heard.
I think we initially found that the personal was very straightforward. We could see personal significance there. The professional, we went with a practical example from one school for teachers who hadn't sufficient Irish, how a principal could support them, and he asked them in group and survey how that could work. So that learning had, we thought, made an institutional difference when you think of those teachers this year, what they're doing to support the next lot of teachers coming in. So although you maybe didn't articulate it or acknowledge it in your first study, it actually has happened. Am I right in that? You want to add to that?
I think so, yeah. You just can almost point to somebody now and say they're an example of how to go about it. They've done it, you know, they've already broken the ground before.
But if you think of how that teacher felt, knowing they're supported, knowing how inadequate they must have felt, how much of a imposter syndrome was going on in their own head, and then they get this support, like the affective domain there is huge. They're personally. You see, because I think you can't take personal and professional and separate them so easily, because they're so bound up in identity, in your teacher identity. Who you are and who you are as a teacher are very fitfulta. There's a huge amount of that. Yeah. Okay, and Maureen.
I'm going to hand over to Carmen actually, because Carmen is
Okay.
as part of the
I did. You did, didn't she?
She did. On reflection, yes.
If you want to.
I don't mind. I suppose I referred back to something you had said in the 4 case studies, if you want to call them that you had used as an example, and how far a train of thought for me as to the impact of
The intervention.
The intervention that could have happened, but the intervention that didn't happen because nobody had access to the incident that you reported to us now, and even if I had it, would I have been able to implement it? You know, when I heard this or whatever.
And what the point I was making in the book is that the group of teachers all offered help to this teacher as to what she could do, and get this book and ask him, and they got a book. I found a book in Veritas on sometimes I feel like this and sometimes I feel like this. A child flying in the playground and then sitting in the fetal position under a tree, colour black and white. And I said to her, don't give it to him, just ask him to look at it, as he's the expert in grief, you know. So will I stop there, Maureen, or will I just finish up with a few wrap-ups?
Oh yes, rather than that. What's your talk fast?
Okay. I came across this paper that I love, and I read it years ago, and came across it there the other night when I was putting this together, and it talks about the ways that the personal interconnects with the social, and so doing contributes to taking action. And they were talking rather that teacher inquiry is as old as teaching itself and is essential to the work of all teachers, including teacher educators, and indeed by some definitions teaching itself is a kind of research. And I suppose what we've done here is we're talking about accredited research, but there's unaccredited research being done all the time by reflective practitioners that should be valued, and I think that's coming out more in Droichead and all of these initiatives that are coming out that allow for professional conversation. And Lebowski talks about that self-study is improvement aimed, which we've said, and it looks for or requires evidence of reframed thinking and transformed practice. Now we've taken the word improved and we said enhanced, because what you could be doing already might be great, but you're trying to enhance it rather than, we're not coming from a deficit model, in other words. And then Pichas go back and say the very process of self-study itself changes. It sure does. I mean, you live with it, you dream with it, you get up with it, as Maureen said, you can't stop being a reflective practitioner, and that can in self prod us to take action. And so why bother? Because studying the self almost inevitably leads to reflective critique, and it goes back to your point, Anne, that you know, you don't just do this on your own. You must have what did you say, not critical friends, constructive friends, to share and to say, but they will ask you the tough questions. And Maureen Glenn asked me a tough question. She said, Mary, you know, I was very proud of what I was doing with thinking and discussion in the class and da-da-da. And Maureen said, but what are you doing that any good teacher wouldn't be doing? And I had to go in and say, God, I don't know, and think about it and say, well, I'm doing it for a start. I didn't do it before. It's new to me, so therefore my learning is new and it's relevant for me. And I had to really think out that, you know, so it was a real cut the knees off. It happened in 2003.
Friend, and it was my job to ask them.
Oh yeah, oh sorry, that was her job, yeah. But it was said so sweetly and so nicely and so respectfully, but it cut the knees off me, and I had to go back and think, and that's the point of a good constructive critical friend as well.
You've moved on since though.
we found our friendship again. Yeah. So again, this is a slide from Glenn and Roche, copied straight from another thing, but it's Maxine Green, whom we adore. So sorry that the poor woman died. She was still teaching into her 98th or 99th year. In her own apartment, she brought in students because she had terrible rheumatic arthritis. But anyway, thinking about our craft often brings conscience to bear on the actions we undertake in the course of our work. And she said this is not surprising, since the capacity to think about what we're doing involves an attentiveness that overcomes distancing and neutrality. And she draws on Virginia Woolf, who talked about the cotton wool of existence and how we can go along in this kind of padded cell type existence. And she talked about Dewey's idea of an aesthetic education as opposed to anesthetic. An anesthetic that just numbs us of all feeling and all thinking and all urge to change. And she said, let's imagine how things could be otherwise. And I recommend you read Maxine Green, anything you can get your hands on that she wrote, because she draws on art, cinema, visual arts, drama, literature, philosophy. She was just a polymath and so humble at the back of it all. And she broke glass ceilings as a Jewish woman, as a married woman, as a mother, and she got, you know, became a dean of philosophy. And she drew on the philosophy of the real moral urgent questions rather than just playing with words, as she called it. So all of that, to do all of that and to make a difference requires regular and systematic reflection. And that ain't for sissies. That is not a flabby armchair thing. Reflection is an action. You have to sit down and you have to do it. And it's hard. It's like trying to do meditation for the first time. You have to empty your mind for a minute of all the internal dialogue and think about something, and you can't Google it. So it's really tough. And people who think that this is flabby navel gazing, this is one of the toughest things you can do, is real deep reflection. And so Finian O'Shea, and this is on our NEARIMeet website, he's in CMTCD, Maureen? I think so. We put out what was the question? Should reflection be mandated or something?
Yes,
was it?
There was a discussion around,
yeah, and he said developing a disposition towards reflective practice is more about being thoughtful rather than thinking. It's more about being self-nurturing rather than self-critical. It's more about being self-aware rather than being centred. True reflection is about developing the personal. It's about learning to value the self as the self. I'd go a little bit further. You know, it's about saying, are my values worth holding? Am I doing the right thing? How do I know? How will I know that these values are? And it's about sustainable practice. If I leave, can the practice that I've put in place be sustained, which was back to what you were saying, Jennifer, as well. How do I create a sustainable practice? And so can research make a difference? We can think about it over coffee, but I think we need to mention about the dangers, and we've all come across it, any of us who are working with teachers, student teachers, you know. You mentioned the word reflection, and I have to write 800 words every Sunday night, you know. So do we want to improve or enhance our practice? Second, I was working with fourth-year undergraduates who had to do their research through self-study action research because that's all I knew about. And yet it didn't suit all of them, and I wondered, what did I lose? There were pure positivists in there who possibly could have generated really good research, or just general interpretative research, but I was forcing them to do self-study. It's not for everybody, perhaps, you know, so we need to think about that. And maybe, you know, I was being a bit like this fellow, you know, I certainly was like that in my class. You can all do the critical thinking between 12 and 1 on a Wednesday. You come back in here now, and then they start to say, Mary, I can think about 400 different ways you could do that some better. Or another child put his hand up and said, so learning to tolerate, I don't know all the answers, learning to accept that knowledge is partial and fluid and always being generated. So that's me done. Thanks.